Hello, and welcome to the Phoenix Cast. I am your host, Albes, and joining me today are Tally and Travis, and I'm welcoming you right now to a new mini-series that we're going to be doing throughout the month of April called Keep Talking. And I'm going to turn it over to Tally to introduce us to what Keep Talking is.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tally, and I work at CU Denver's case management office. I work as a prevention educator and case manager. And so at CU Denver, there was an in-person held event in 2019 where volunteers shared their mental health experiences. Keep Talking Today is a recorded audio series aimed at decreasing societal, campus, and perceived stigma around mental health. The goal of these series is to normalize conversations around mental health and increase help-seeking behavior with mental health professionals, staff, faculty, and peers. Resources on and off campus are provided at the end of each episode. And so each episode, we have individuals within our community who share their experience with mental health. Volunteers were all encouraged to share their narrative through spoken word, slam poetry, storytelling, and art. There is a lot of power in sharing your own narrative and proof that we are not alone in our experiences. So with us today, we have Dr. Travis Heath, who will introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Tally. So I'm Travis Heath. I don't know, what do you want to know about me? I guess the professional things, I'm a licensed psychologist. I, taught at Metropolitan State University of Denver for 12 years in the psychology department and graduated from there back in the Stone Age. Like back when I was a student, we couldn't do all of this cool Zoom stuff that we could now. And, recently I've taken a job at the University of Denver in the International Disaster Psychology Trauma and Global Mental Health program. And so probably the part that's most relevant to, I'm a psychologist, so there's the mental health part, but the stories part, I'm a narrative therapist. And so I'm really interested in the idea of stories, how we story our life, how our life gets storied for us sometimes, and just how we make sense of the world, which to me is through stories. That's probably the part that's maybe most relevant to what we're going to talk about today. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So I asked Travis to come talk with us because Travis did speak in 2019 at the Keep Talking event and shared about the power of sharing your story and narrative and really focusing on, in general, just destigmatizing mental health. I know that this is a popular conversation, especially now with everything that's been, I think, going on and how people have had time to really internalize what they're going through and recognize that some people are having a tough time. And so, Travis, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the power of sharing your narrative and what that maybe looks like or can be like for people in your experiences.
Yeah. Well, first, that event in 2019, what a great event. My favorite part of that was listening to all the participants share their stories. It came in different forms too. It wasn't just as simple as like someone sharing a story like we might think about a story just with the spoken word. I mean, there was like some slam poetry that was going on there. There's some music. And of course, there's spoken word and story inside of that. But man, that was a really good event. So I reflect positively on it. I still remember some of the stories to this day, which, okay, now to the power of stories. Would I have remembered the event if some of those stories had not been shared? Maybe not, and maybe not in the same way. So I think, the first thing about stories is we organize our worlds in terms of stories, right? We make sense of our place in the world in terms of stories, what's meaningful to us. I would argue that even history is about being storied, so like in my work as a psychologist in practice, people, they'll say, well, I can't change the past. I guess that's literally true in that you can't go back and change the events that have happened in the past. But we do have the ability to tell stories about what's happened in the past in new ways. And sometimes when we do that, it completely changes our relationship with those events. So there's power in that. Stories are the closest thing I've ever found to being able to change the past. Now, that's sort of a dangerous assertion. I can't literally change the past, but people really can change how they make sense of themselves and what's happened to them in the world based on the stories that are told. To the question of the power, there's power in terms of how we relate to the past. I think there's also power in how we make sense of the present and then storing out into the future as well. Something I've done, especially with young people I've worked with, and I learned this from a great mentor of mine, David Epstein, who co-created narrative therapy some 40 years or so ago now, I guess. I mean, it was called narrative therapy more like 30 years ago. But, it's this exercise where I'm, wrapping up with a young person in psychotherapy, and I'll write a letter based on what they've told me, about their hopes and dreams and where they want to go in the world. And I'll write this letter that talks about them reaching those goals, and what it looks like, and really try to story it and make it come alive. And then, this was pre-COVID doing this. Obviously, everything's online now, but I put it in a physical envelope and I leave it slightly open. And I put like a sticky note on there that says, do not open for 6 months or 8 months or 12 months. Well, curiosity is going to get that cat every time, right? They're going to open it. And I want them to open it, of course, because what they're seeing is the stories of their hopes and dreams laid out as though it's already occurred, right? And then that has a power too, because we often step into, even unconsciously, living through these stories of who we might want to be going into the future. And so for me, those are all very powerful. If we can deal with the past, we can deal with the present, now we can deal with the future all through story. I mean, that takes us through, most of the human experience, I would argue.
Yeah, a few things that come up for me is reframing your stories. So the ability to change your story in that way over time, and also writing down your stories before an event or before something happens. And it kind of sounds like that can maybe be a predictor, kind of put your hopes and dreams into that story, and maybe that can come to life in some sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we see this all the time. Young kids are really good at this, by the way. Young kids story without even realizing, that they're doing it. Sometimes for adults, it's a little weird, because stories tell us that a lot of stuff should be weird when we're adults, right? But young people are really good at this, where you have some glimpse of what you want to do or the kind of person you want to be. And if you watch, like I watch my 4-year-old just in her play, and she's clearly projecting ideas about who she wishes to be into the world, right? And so it's like that to me is a beautiful thing. And young people do it without thinking about it, because they don't have that sort of sense of the gaze staring at them. I mean, my 4-year-old's starting to, unfortunately, and that's sort of sad, because I realize she's going to become more and more aware of that, right? But when you watch her, whether it's through art, whether it's through play, right, she's projecting stories about who she wishes to be in the world. And we can do this with people. We can do this with older people, with adults as well, right? If it takes a little longer to get them involved sometimes, because it feels strange and it feels weird. Like, how often do people come into psychotherapy? This is one of the first questions I ask. Like, what are your hopes and dreams of living? And people look at me like, what? Like, I'm supposed to be talking to you about being depressed or anxious or whatever it is. By the way, we can talk about all those things. Those are stories too. They're important stories. But, rarely, especially when we get into adulthood, do we talk about stories of hopes and dreams. And when you can really get into telling a rich story, now the possibility that it can become a reality gets larger, right? Because it's like you tell the story in such detail, the characters are so rich, you go like, unconsciously usually, like, well, I could actually live into that. Like, we do a lot with positivity, these are the strengths of character of a person, and that's fine. But so if I believe you to be kind, and I write kind on a sticky note and I stick it on your shoulder, that's fine. But what's going to happen to that sticky note? Well, it's going to fall off. It's probably going to fall off within the next hour. And that's kind of what it's like when we just talk about people's strengths. Well, you're kind. However, if we tell stories about people's strengths, right, and really rich stories, and we develop the storyline and we develop the characters, now those things take root in a different way. It becomes harder to dismiss it and just say something like, oh, come on, you're just saying that. It's like, no, because there are actual stories that you've lived through and continue to live through that validate that. So now if it's kindness or whatever it is, it becomes something that's storied and real.
I really love that. And something that I was thinking about when you were telling the story about, like writing this letter to your young clients was actually how that I think I did something similar regarding my own relationship, like at a New Year's resolution party, right? Like you were supposed to write yourself like a letter to the future you. And my partner and I were there, or we were going through a rough patch in our relationship because all relationships just, spoiler alert, things come up. And 6 months later, the host of that party mailed it to us. And so we addressed it to each other. And I think in a very interesting way, like we storied our relationship in a way that we lived into. And I hadn't thought about that until you like mentioned that, because we kept those letters and we look back at it and we're like, yeah, like these are the reasons why we want to still be in a relationship. You have fights, you have disagreements, and there's also the good stuff.
Yes. And so what do we story and what don't we story? Like that's interesting, isn't it? And yeah, it sounds really powerful with you and your partner, the way that sort of manifests. Yeah, I think often about when I sit with a person, what are the stories that are being told? But most importantly, what are the stories that aren't? And I work with a lot of couples in the work that I do. And this is understandable, when couples are in a rough patch. What are the stories that are being told? Well, the stories are all about the rough patch and all about these are how we're not compatible. And my work as a therapist is not to deny the existence of these stories, but rather to encourage people to think that we are all multi-storied, and all relationships are multi-storied too. And so even though one story may be rising to prominence right now, this is not the only story. An easy way with couples is to go in the past, and this usually works. There are some exceptions sometimes, and just ask them about how they met. Like why, what brought the two of you together? And you'll see them start to light up in certain ways again. And then there's kind of an easy transition to that. That could take 30 minutes, by the way. And they tell a really rich story about how they met. But then, it's like, hey, all that stuff you were just talking about when you first met, is it all gone? Yeah, and you're like, no, I guess not. Like, well, how does it show up still in your relationship? If you wanted more of it, if you wanted to kind of create or call upon more of it, what would you do, right? And now we're having a whole different conversation. And you can do this not just with couples. I mean, you can do this with, if somebody says I'm depressed. Well, depression can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I mean, in psychiatry, there's one idea with a set of symptoms about what quote unquote depression is. It manifests very differently often for people, though. But what starts to happen is depression tells the story of a person's life when they're in the throes of depression. And often what I'm interested in is, what if you told the story of your life? Like, what story would it tell that's different than the story depression would tell, right? And you can kind of start to compare those narratives. And it's not to deny the existence of depression's story, because that's real and people feel it. It's just to encourage people to understand the ways in which they're multi-storied, and depression kind of has its own voice. Like, people use the term self-talk, which is always interesting to me, because it's been my observation that this talk isn't actually from the self. It's often from the culture at large, about stories about who people can be and who they can't be. And it's been around so long that it feels as though it's of the self. So often part of my work is to welcome people's own voices back into the mix and give them the authorial rights to their story, right? And the telling of their story. And that can be challenging. I mean, it might sound simple, and it is a simple idea, but it's often not easy to execute, because these dominant cultural stories just swim around us. One thing I liked in your story, you sort of said, well, hey, yeah, in relationships, of course you hit rough patches. I like that because it was a bit of a counter narrative, because that's not what society says. Look, if you're soulmates, which that's an interesting story in itself, but if you're quote unquote soulmates, well, then you'll have great sex all the time. You'll always be connected. You'll be each other's best friends. Good luck with that story. By the way, I saw a research study, I don't know time because of COVID here, in the last, 5 years probably. And it said that in the last 100 years, romantic relationships in the United States, partners in romantic relationships, expect more out of those relationships than they have at any other point in the last 100 years. And they invest less time in those relationships than they have at any other point in the last 100 years.
Oh my gosh. Don't even get me started on the nuclear family as a function of capitalism. Because I think it's all, but that's an aside. But absolutely, I think that's part of what we try to do at the PCA is also talk to people about like these unrealistic expectations they have about relationships of like, there's never ever going to be problems, right? Like, and even in healthy relationships where abuse is not present, you're going to have conflict.
Absolutely. And then so how do we, often these stories don't get told though, right? Because there's these dominant cultural stories that run to the contrary. And of course, this can be done in a lot of different contexts, but for me as a psychologist, this is often what I'm involved with people is, what are their preferred stories of identity versus what are the stories about that are told about them or who they're supposed to be, who they can and can't be. And I guess that gets back to the power of stories because all of these are storied practices.
That also makes me think about how when people hear a word or a story, so let's say they hear depression or they hear soulmates, and they come up, another person comes up with this entire story that changes the narrative completely, can change the narratives of someone else's story based on their assumptions or what they think is real and what might not actually be.
Yeah, or it's like an outline of parameters of where your story must go, like it can only fit in this sort of small area. And if it's outside of that, then it's not an acceptable story, which is, I think this often traps people. I had someone ask me the other day, and this is not my language, it's their language, but they said, like, how do you work with crazy people all day? It's like, and as a psychologist, that's not that rare of a question, unfortunately. And I said, I've never really experienced working with any crazy people. I have experienced people that are under the strong influence of cultural stories that are crazy making, but I haven't worked with crazy people. And to me, there's a distinct difference. And so, again, kind of what are the parameters that we're allowed to live within or not? Now, of course, the trick here is that there really are no parameters. Like once we're now, sometimes, listen, take stories of masculinities, for example, working with male identified persons who might want to challenge some of the traditional ideas of masculinities. There could be physical violence that happens if one breaks free from these. So this is not something to be taken lightly, where it's just the world is your canvas and you can do whatever. There's lots of considerations. But with that said, I do think that once we can get outside of these tightly sort of prescriptive parameters of who we're told we could be or not be, that opens up a lot for people. And in terms of mental health, it allows people to begin to start to feel okay, dare I even say comfortable within their own skin.
This also makes me think about how stories are being told and how people are listening to their own story. And I know that you were speaking a little bit about in your therapy how you want people to share their stories, and then on the other side of that, people sharing their experience, their story of that person. I don't know if that made sense, but so for example, for my mom's birthday, I had all of her best friends and families just write these really wonderful things about her and was able to share it with her. And she said to me, she was like, Tali, you only read about these things or hear about these things when someone dies, as I'm a Jewish person. So during Shiva, which is like 7 days of grieving and mourning and sharing stories of that person. And so it made me think about like how we don't hear that enough. And also how women's stories, also connecting it to my mom, like can be shared in different ways and also heard in different ways as well. And we're not always hearing the story that we think is being told about ourselves.
I love that story. It's like you, and I don't know, maybe you have encountered narrative therapy at some point. It tends not to, it tends to be on the margins. But what you just described with your mom is actually a core tenet of narrative practice. And I'll explain what I mean. Psychology as a enterprise is so individually focused. Like everything is housed within the body of the individual, within the brain of the individual, and I think that's highly problematic. And so I do think there are advantages in going into a psychotherapeutic relationship, sitting with another person and sharing your story, and perhaps having that person stand in support of your story, or that's great. However, it's rather limiting because what happens then is then the person's going back into a world that's telling the same stories about them that they were prior to coming in to speak to me. So then how do we address this? Well, David Epstein and Michael White, the creators of narrative therapy, borrowing, of course, from all kinds of knowledges that existed long before psychology and psychiatry, but they understood that we need a community to stand in support of the story, to validate the stories of this person, because problems tend to be dismembering, right? They disconnect people from their communities. So we were talking about depression, which again, I have trouble with just that huge blanket label, but if you'll allow me just to use that term for a second, depression, it's dismembering. It starts to disconnect people from their communities, right? And so then how do we remember them? Not remember like recall, but remember, help them reconstruct their communities. Well, a great way to do this is through a practice that you just brought up, which is through like letter writing campaigns, right? This is something narrative therapy has always done, where not only do we take time to listen to the person's preferred identity, but then we write letters in support of it. Or perhaps we congregate all together, right? And tell stories that stand in support of this person's identity. And then what starts to happen is, rather than the age-old problem of psychotherapy, which is, well, my therapist, if it goes well, my therapist gets me and that feels good. But then the progress I feel like I make gets derailed by the outside world. Now, psychology would, of course, say, well, you just have to learn how to deal with that. They prescribe some sort of individualist way of dealing with it. But what you're describing, Talia, and what I think narrative therapy is trying to do is a more collectivist approach, which is that the story, let me put it this way, we breathe life into the story when the community takes up the story, right? In a way that we can't when it just exists between one or two people. Now, again, if you have one person to share your story with, great. I'm not saying that's not of value, but how can we make this more of a community affair? And I'll say one other thing. It is sad that in the United States and more of the Western world, we tend to wait until people die to really celebrate and stand in support of these stories, which to me is really sad, because why not share these stories as we're living? Like, what might that do for someone's living to hear the stories from other people and hear them kind of standing in support of our own identities? I mean, that could propel us forward in our communities in ways that it might not happen otherwise if we didn't get a chance to hear them. So it's interesting you bring that up, because I feel like it's, you're almost describing a quote unquote narrative therapy intervention,
Oops.
I really like that you bring up that this is especially common in the Western world, especially because I'm from a Caribbean background, and I do identify Caribbean culture as a storytelling culture. But even then, like, there were so many stories I heard about my grandfather after he passed that I had never heard in my entire life. Just like really amazing details of his life that I'll never be able to ask him about. Even coming from a storytelling culture where we're always telling, the ridiculous thing that Uncle so-and-so did back in the old country, which is not what we call it, but
I know what you're referencing.
I was just connecting it and thinking about just sharing your collective story, bringing it back to a little bit about what I've asked volunteers and just volunteers in this Keep Talking series is to share their story and to share. And what if we lived in a world where people just shared their narrative in a way that was true to them and true to themselves, and felt like, I don't know, they had the ability to reframe it in a way like, this is how I've overcome this, and this is how I've lived with this, and look at where I am now. And I think so many of our stories that are shared with us here, like, are able to speak to that. And so I think it would be really cool if that was happening.
Yeah, I like that.
Worldwide.
And I'll add another question. What if we lived in a world that taught us to receive the stories of others? Because like this might sound like a little bit of an aside, but I promise I'll tie it together. I've been
I
thinking
trust
a
you.
lot about vulnerability
Mm.
and this idea that like vulnerability is supposed to be a performance. Like I decide to be vulnerable and then I perform it. And this seems like a really popular idea, and it might have some merit. I think ideas can be helpful sometimes and not helpful other times, or helpful for some people, not for other people. But I've just been thinking about vulnerability, and to me, I don't think it's a performance as much as it is a result of something, or a set of conditions that result in something. Like I think during my PhD program, when I had people telling me to be vulnerable as part of being a PhD student in psychology, and I was like, screw this. I mean, unconsciously, I was like, because I don't feel comfortable. I'm not sure I could have articulated that in that moment. Thereby, vulnerability to me is not a performance, but it's a result of a set of conditions. So when we think about telling the story, perhaps just as important is our ability to receive it. And when we think about difficult stories, the word that gets used a lot these days is trauma, right? Traumatic stories. It's been my observation and experience that we live in a culture that in no way prepares people how to receive and tend to those stories. So then what usually happens if someone moves to share it is that the person makes a joke, the person sort of gives them the nonverbals that like, I'm not okay receiving this, and look, not every story is to be received by every person. I understand, but I'm just saying generally, it seems like we don't tend to that. And then, so that to me is one important part. How do we create this set of conditions? And I have some ideas about it, but boy, like I wish we started with young people, because I think if you now, I think about my 4-year-old and she, I mean, she's 4, so sometimes she just goes off on her own story. But I think generally speaking, if you maybe my 8-year-old's a better example, almost 9-year-old, I feel like she in her social circles receives stories really nicely, and even difficult stories, I feel like receives them really nicely. And so I have a hypothesis then that, and hell, I don't know what's in our nature and what's not. I'm not smart enough to make claims about that. But I just want to say, generally speaking, I think as people, we're geared in that direction, like to receive the stories of others. But somewhere along the line, we lose that, or we don't practice it, or I mean, it could be a combination of things. And then we become adults, and like we have these stories and no place for them to go, no place for them to be received, and they just sort of fester inside of us. And was it Audre Lorde who said, there's I won't get it as eloquently as she said. I think it was Audre Lorde. There's nothing worse than an untold story inside of you, something like that. I want to say it was Audre Lorde. And boy, I think that that's true. But then we as a culture, how do we take responsibility, a collective responsibility, to create spaces where these stories can be shared?
I really love that you brought it back to like that we do in some way possibly have this innate ability to be receiving stories, because like you, I see this in young children all the time, and I also think about my own life as like a young child. And like I was an overly empathetic child who wanted to talk all the time to everyone around me, and like that was not something that was supported in our culture when I got to a certain age, right? And so it then turned into me then just taking on narratives of other people that I was not ever able to escape until I found a new community that was able to see aspects of my story that my previous community was not.
Yeah, boy, that's interesting, isn't it? And then it to me, it begs questions like, well, how did this community come to be able to see your stories in these ways? What was it about that community? What was it about their experiences? What was it about their ethics and values as a community that maybe allowed them to do it, right? To me, it raises all of these interesting questions about creating an environment for which stories can be received. And again, maybe stories can't be received in every environment, or all stories can't be received in all environments. But boy, I feel like as a whole, we struggle with that culturally. Like we spend so much time pathologizing individual people in our culture, where I see a lot more sort of cultural pathologies that exist, that I wish we would spend a little more time doing that. Like I read this article, it was really interesting, about men during the pandemic, and how men had taken up walking and talking to each other on, because for a time anyway, we didn't see one another, and so they'd go for walks and talk to each other, and like the difference that this was making in the lives of men. Now, having done the work I do for 20 years, I go, well, of course this is a no-brainer. But what was interesting to me is that it wasn't a no-brainer. Like men were reading this article and going, oh god, like maybe there is merit to this. And again, I want to make the argument that, male identified people aren't somehow it's not that they don't need to share their stories. Like that's not it. It's that there's a set of cultural conditions that has made it much more difficult for those stories to be shared, right?
Yeah, that really makes me think. I mean, And you spoke about your experience, just the ability when you move to somewhere new or have the opportunity to try something new, how your story you can reframe it or you can change it in different ways and into a way maybe a story was once told that you want to live out or a totally different narrative that you want to live by. I think that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people do that, especially when they're going to college or moving to a new city or starting a new job or any new transition in their lives. Like that ability represents itself.
Absolutely. I mean, like, so one of the reasons I'm so excited about your project with Keep Talking and making it virtual and keeping it going is because personally, like when I went away to college, there was a similar program in my undergrad where people were telling their own stories, and it was like at a social justice retreat, and someone shared their story of depression and finding help and like really having a hard time with the medication stigma and like really having to get over that. And like, Caribbean culture is very anti-medication. And I would argue American culture is anti-mental health medication overall. And that was the first time I saw that there was like a way out, and that like someone had did it. Right. And so like for me, I came back to that social justice retreat the next year and told the story of someone else telling their story and how that helped me get help.
See, that's lovely because stories travel, don't they? And you know, Emmy, we're talking about just like stories of your grandfather and so forth. And like, this is another power of story, is that it moves across generations, right? And story now, you know, now we have pictures and we have Lord knows what else we have to try and document things. But I still think there's nothing quite like a story because, you know, I love art. And so with all due respect to a painting or a photograph, if it's of someone you know, like a person or people you know in your life, what's the first question you almost always ask? It's like, tell me the story. Oh, like what's going on here? Like you want to know the story of the people that were involved, or another in a storied language, the characters that were involved. And so stories travel. And then a story can be shared, and it can be shared again, and it can be shared again, and it can be shared again, right? And stories have this way, just like I was talking about the 2019 Keep Talking event, that I can picture even now the stage and some of the people talking, I can, because of the stories that they were telling. And so if stories can travel, think about the power in that, right? And what does that mean for us? Like when I think about everything that's going on in the world right now, not just COVID, but continued racism and forms of injustice, and thinking about abolition movements and other things. Of course, these like what's interesting about this is not new. Like these movements have been going on in United States in one form or another for 400 years. Some people think racism and all this just visited us in the last 12 months. Other people, well, just during the Trump administration or something, the last 40. No, this has been going on for 400 years. And so the other part about stories is that when we understand our stories in a historical sense, they often help us navigate the present moment and reimagine a new future, right? And otherwise, what we're doing is we're simply replicating efforts that our ancestors have long since figured out, or at least made great strides on. And because we're disconnected from those stories, we can't use them in the current world. So to me, when I think about some of the challenges we're dealing with now and how we're going to move forward, stories are, not surprisingly, I guess, as much as I've been talking about stories here, but that's where most of our answers lie, right? It's not in a concept. It's not like in an academic idea or a concept. It's in the stories of how our ancestors have gone about navigating these things, right? And we'd be fools to not seek out those stories and listen to them and carry them with us in our current work.
What you bring up really also makes me think of the Holocaust and the survivors that we have living right now. And there's a program called March of the Living where high school students can go to Poland and Israel to visit concentration camps and then go to Israel kind of as like a we survived and this is where we are now. But the part of the trip is listening to Holocaust survivors share their story and living, like carrying on their story so that every year, every month or Holocaust Remembrance Day or something, a piece of you remembers the story and has a part of this person with you. And we continue that, or the idea is that we hope history doesn't repeat itself and we're able to help these survivors live on and help their families live on. And so that just made me think of that a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And again, sometimes, not in all cases, sometimes history books are, I guess the people writing the history books don't tell great stories. They tell boring stories. They tell linear stories. And I don't think that that's particularly helpful in terms of us engaging with our history, because, you know, kids read this and they're like, this is boring. Kids know a good story from a not good story. It doesn't come alive in all of its vibrancy, right? And all of its sort of fullness and color. And so, but when we listen to stories, for example, like you were just saying, Tali, of Holocaust survivors, I mean, and I mean this sincerely, I'm not being hyperbolic. Anytime I encounter a story like that and really listen, I'm moved to tears. Like I tell you, every damn time I'm moved to tears. It captures something in our very existence of like what it means to be a human being. Whereas if I read some abstract number, like, you know, X number of people were killed in the Holocaust, like I feel like that's part of what's happening with COVID right now, is that we're not good with large numbers as human beings, you know? And so we see these numbers and it's kind of like, I'm sure that's bad or whatever. But yet you really listen to a story of someone who's navigated COVID or who lost someone to COVID or whatever. And now that hits differently, doesn't it? Because it moves us at the core of what I think makes us human.
Yeah, absolutely. Travis, for the sake of time, and I recognize that we can have hours of conversation around this. It's fascinating. I do want to share with you some of the questions that I am asking volunteers when I do meet with them. And so I can share them with you all, maybe one at a time, and see if you have any thoughts around them.
Right.
So the first question I ask, and I typically prepare them, so I'm not catching them off guard. Hopefully not, but how do you give yourself grace to meet expectations that you might not have energy for?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Grace. I feel like not enough stories are told about grace. I don't, at least in my world, I feel like grace isn't talked about a lot. And I feel like in a capitalist, neoliberalized society, we don't talk a lot about grace. We talk a lot about like, keep going, keep going, keep going, you know, and that in turn creates this sort of sense that like we're hard on ourselves. But there again, that language, I'm hard on myself. It's always like, are you hard on yourself, or have the structures in which we lived sort of, you've internalized this dialogue that to be a valid, good person, you must be hard on yourself. But I won't digress too far that direction. But the idea of grace, that's really lovely. Now, when I think about, you know, anytime we're struggling with something or our communities are struggling with something, the power of grace, you know, I'm just thinking in my own life, I'm decent, I think, at showing grace for others, maybe not as good at showing it for myself, right? Per what we just talked about. But some of the moments that really stick out for me are moments where I was able to give the gift of grace to another, right? Like that always feels really like, you know, a moment where I could just have understandably disengaged or cursed someone out or whatever. And maybe sometimes, you know, people deserve that or what, you know, whatever the stories are about that. I guess what I'm saying is maybe everyone doesn't deserve grace for every act always. However, I think there are these great opportunities to show grace. And I'm feeling it in my body just as I'm talking about it, like the goosebumps sort of feeling of moments where I've been able to show grace. You know, I feel like as I get older, I hope anyways, I'm getting better at that. And then also what it feels like to be shown grace by others. Yeah. So boy, I love that question. And then the question that comes up for me with that is, if we had the ability to grant more grace in our culture, what would that mean for our mental health, just generally speaking? I don't know the answer, but I wonder.
It's a great question. I also don't know the answer, but it does have me wondering.
I mean, anecdotally, I've worked in offices where I felt like I had no grace, and in comparison to working in an office where if I tell a supervisor like, hey, I'm having a really hard day, I'm triggered and I think I need to take some health time, like, my mental health is far better at this job than in any other job I've had.
Same. Yeah, I've had the same sort of experiences.
I almost connect grace to vulnerability in a way. By giving myself grace, I set those boundaries, or I need to take a break, or I need to step away from this. I think that comes up a little bit for me. Another question that we ask, or that I ask, is what advice do you have for people going through something similar?
Love that question. It's something that I often ask people I work with in psychotherapy if they'd be willing to share in a letter form, and so that I can give the letter to other people who come in that are encountering similar struggles. And then also for the person, as they write the letter, it reminds them that, like, oh, yeah, like I can deal with this. Like, I have a track record. I have stories in the bank that show that I had to traverse this landscape.
Right. Like, I have these resources, and now I know how to use them. So here I go. Another question, just relating it to students and being in school, is what advice do you have for students to get involved on campus?
Yeah, and boy, that feels like an even more complicated question in this current world we live in. Maybe it'll get less complicated in a COVID sort of way in the coming months. We'll see, I guess. But then just the idea of connection with community and connection with others. Again, so often I feel like the way we've been taught by psychiatry and psychology to think of mental health is it's such an individualized project as opposed to a collective one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. There's so many opportunities on campus and off campus that I think can be a great reminder of, like, you're not alone in this. You're not alone in general. Although, especially right now, everything can feel so isolating and lonely.
No doubt.
Yeah. And my final question is, and you can feel free to answer it for yourself if you like, but what are some things you like to do for yourself?
What are some things I like to do for myself? Well, I've always liked sports, and basketball in particular, which I played through college. Well, I played for a little bit in college and found out I wasn't all that good, but I love basketball. So basketball is often at the center of, in one way or another, of things I like to do for myself. Walks, I like walking. I like running too, but those two things are different. When I'm running, usually I'm listening to music or something. If I'm walking, I might be doing a little more thinking. Not that you can't think when you run, but I don't know, it's just different. So running and walking, I like both of those. And I feel like if I'm working on writing something, walking is like the best thing I can do. It'll, a chapter writes itself when I'm walking, it feels like. So that's something I really like doing. Reading's good. That's a tricky one for me though, because otherwise, if I'm not careful, because I do enjoy so much the work that I do, then I'm, reading for quote unquote work, but it's pleasurable too. So, that's tricky, but reading is definitely something I like to do for myself too. And then, families, I've got two young kids and a partner, and I guess, you could say that's not for myself because it involves other people, but, like it's pretty great to watch kids are amazing. They're just amazing. Like if you watch now, it's a lot of stress sometimes, and it's not always easy raising kids, but when you can sit back and just really witness them for a bit, it's like they're amazing beings, and you just watch how much they're learning and how they approach so that sort of things. I really enjoy that sort of thing. And then the last thing, again, it involves another person, but with my partner, just talking about weird stuff, well, it's not weird to us, but, we often ask one another, like, what if someone else was like, do normal people talk about this? And usually the answer is no. But normal, I guess, just means statistically frequent or infrequent, but in this case, yeah, so we'll just get into weird conversations about whatever, just about how the world is functioning. And I adore those conversations, and they challenge me and make me think and add new perspectives. So yeah, I really enjoy doing that too. Hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, it's your narrative, it's your experience. So, but thank you for sharing what recharges you and what makes you feel good. I appreciate that. And I I also like this question. I think it's a nice way of framing, like, what's your self-care? What do you do to take care of yourself? And is there anything else that you'd love to add or share with us while we're here today and continuing to keep talking?
Yeah, I just appreciate what you're doing, and like the idea of stories are obviously so dear to me and the work that I do. I think though they're dear to most people if they really stop and think about it, and so I appreciate just the centering of storytelling and stories and the impact that they can have. And then also kind of the connection with that and mental health. Yeah, that's just right in my wheelhouse. And so for obvious reasons, that makes me happy, but it doesn't just make me happy in a selfish sense. It makes me happy because I think it's of benefit to people, like if people were to listen to this, I hope that they would, start thinking about their own stories and what stories they're telling, what stories are being told about them that maybe without their consent that they wish, they like, I never said society could tell this story, but it is anyway, right? And then what happens to people, like what does that elicit in people when stories are told without their consent? And then, what is it when you start embracing stories of your own preferred identity and living through those, what happens? Like, I hope it just raises questions and it gets people thinking in a story form about their own lives. And if that happens, like that's a big win as far as I'm concerned. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
That was a wonderful thing to add. So thank you for adding that. And I mean, Travis, I cannot say thank you enough for being here and being a part of this and sharing your experience and just talking about sharing your narrative. When I asked you what are some things that you like to do for yourself, I also thought about things that I like to do for myself and was curious, also, if you wanted to share things that you do to care for yourself as well. I realize we put Travis on the spot, so we can also share our experiences as well.
Absolutely. So I like to engage in movement. Right now I'm on a big indoor cycling kick. It really helps me literally spin my wheels and just get rid of excess energy, of which I have a lot. And sometimes not enough, unfortunately. And then I also really enjoy Audible or like listening to audiobooks. That's been really, really helpful for me, especially like similar to Travis. I have to read a lot for my job, and I don't always want to physically read. So the audiobook helps me kind of separate that. And yeah, connecting with my sister, which is a new thing. And I know that when we were preparing for this conversation, one of the things we talked about was like one of my self-care things is talking to my sister and comparing like what are our childhood versions of stories of like things that happened in our childhood versus like how we view them as adult. And that's been like a really impactful experience. And it's really shown me that in many ways in my life, I do seek out storytelling because of the way that stories have been weaponized against me and the communities that I'm a part of. So just really love this conversation. And it reminds me why I really get lost in a good story. Tully, I would love to hear. I mean, I know doing podcasts, you often are asking so many questions and no one's asking you questions. So what do you like to do for yourself?
First of all, I'm very new to podcasts, so I'm constantly asking questions. Just like, is this right? But for myself right now, I've always heard that breathing is really helpful, and I've always like kind of rolled my eyes at that or rolled my eyes at yoga and not been connected to it. However, during the pandemic, yoga has been my go-to. It's been shocking how much it has helped me through this process. Also, talking to my therapist, like finding a good therapist, which is not like finding a connection with someone is not always the easiest, and recognizing that you need to find that connection with a therapist as well. But having good conversations just around my own experience has been really helpful. I have been looking for something to do with my hands, like some sort of art or crocheting or knitting or something, but I haven't connected to anything yet. But so if anyone has any recommendations, but that's kind of, it's ever changing, I feel like, for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then do you want to, since this is your mini series on our podcast line, do you kind of want to close us out?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you, Travis. Thank you so much for being here and having this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you again to the Office of Case Management and our partners, the Phoenix Center, Student Life and Campus Community, Active Minds, Auraria Recovery Community, Student and Community Counseling Center, and CU Denver's Digital Strategies team. Please complete the survey at the end of each episode and enter to win an appreciation item. The survey will be listed in the description of each episode. Finally, thank you to all of our volunteers for your bravery, and thank you all for listening.